right, thank you so much for joining us. You've prepared some opening remarks, so you can go straight on to those.
You have already done the introduction, huh?
Yeah.
Well, good evening. It's an honor for me to have been invited to speak here in the Oxford Union. I've read all the famous speakers who have been here, so I feel really very privileged to be able to talk to you as well here. One question which I always get asked, and especially in America, but in other places as well, how was it possible that a man like Hitler was able to influence cultured people like America? And there is of course an explanation, and I'll just shortly to tell you about this, what happened really in Germany, because you have to really go back to the First World War, which Germany and Austria, I come from Austria, from Vienna, and Austria was the most powerful country in Europe before the First World War, and they lost the war, of course, with Turkey and Italy and Germany. And unfortunately, the Allied put terrible condition at the Treaty of Versailles, the peace treaty. And those countries, Austria and Germany, became very poor. You can't imagine, my grandparents and my parents lived through this. And they told me, there was really no food, no work. People were barefoot in the snow, and people were desperate. It was a king... empire, Austria, it became a republic, and in Germany as well there was a Weimar Republic who tried all kind of governments to put Germany back on its feet, but they never succeeded. And so a man came and said, I have a solution, I can help, I will put things back again and will become a very powerful state again. And people were so desperate that they said, well, we don't lose anything, let him try. And funnily enough, he had a few good ideas, like the Autobahn, the motorway, and the Volkswagen. He said everybody will have a car, the Beetle, Volkswagen car for the people. And things started to get better. He probably had a lot of debt, but it seems to work a bit. But to get his people behind him even more there were a lot of Jews in Germany and Austria, quite they say, yes, every Jew is rich, which is of course not true at all. But a lot of Jews had good positions. They were lawyers and doctors and surgeons and actors and writers, same in Austria. And so Hitler thought, if I accuse the Jews of that say guilty of everything going wrong, then I will get more people following me. And that really did happen, because deep down in most people, unfortunately, is still a little bit of anti-Semitism. And the other point was, and that was very important, Russia, big powerful country, had become communist. And when a country is so poor like Germany and Austria, a lot of people were communists. And there were street fights with the Nazi party. But Hitler said he's going to fight communism. And that was a very important point, because the Western world was really more afraid of communism than of the Hitler Party. And so even England, the royalty at the time supported him, and the Vatican supported him, and everybody really admired Hitler. And so this was the reason why, instead of fighting Hitler, they said, let him come to power, then he will fight communism. So in 1935-36, they could still have really got rid of Hitler, the world, but they didn't want to. So this was really how he was able to succeed. And in Austria, so as I said, I come from Vienna. We were Jewish, but we were not really religious. We did go to the high holiday, but and in Austria as well, you had to have religious education. It was compulsory in school, so everybody knew the Jewish children were called out from their class, And we had Jewish education in our class, and then we went back to the general class. They had, at that time, there were only Catholics and Jewish people, and so everybody knew who was a Jew. And the minute the Nazis marched in March 1938, the Austrians became fanatic Nazis. They stood in the street with a Heil Hitler salute, and suddenly they all had swastika flags. And, you know, Hitler had promised them that they will be powerful. And as I said, Austria had become a tiny, tiny country, and so they were quite keen to join Germany and become as powerful as Hitler promised them. So we were lucky, we were able to get out. That was really again the problem why Hitler was able to kill the Jews, because the world didn't want, especially in 1938, when already many German Jews had left Germany and were settling in England and America. When the Austrian Jews wanted to flee, people didn't want them anymore. So we lost many, many of our family members. Some of them did get away, some to England, some to America. But my father had business in Holland, and we left sent to Amsterdam, because in the First World War, Holland was not in the war. They bypassed it. And many Jewish people thought, well, that will happen again. Nobody had imagined that Hitler was, if you look on a map, you will see, but by 1941, really had more or less conquered the whole of Europe. Quite amazing. And, but in this time, of course, Hitler did go to Holland. So we came to Holland actually quite late in February through Belgium. We were first living in Belgium, then we went to Holland in February 1940, during the war was already declared, but there was not much fighting actually going on, because the fighting was really in Poland. And so we settled there. We lived on the Merwedeplein, which is a big open square, and there were small apartments and no gardens. And after school, all the children came out to play in the street. And I was 11 years old, and one day a little girl came to me and said her name was Anne Frank. And of course at that time she was just one of my playmates. The Frank family had come from Frankfurt, from Germany, and Otto Frank, her father, told me when in 1933 the Nazis walked through the streets singing, when Jewish blood drips from our daggers, then things will get better. He realized this is not a country where I want to bring up a family, and they were able to leave early in 1933. So Anne had not experienced any prejudice, any discrimination. She was quite different from me. I had already experienced for several months in Austria very, very bad anti-Semitism, and as well, first in Belgium, I was treated as a refugee. You know, at that time, that was not so popular. Refugees didn't really exist like now. People mix from all kind of country, in London especially, you know. You have people from all over the world, but that was not at the time. In the 30s and 40s, people stayed in their country, if at all, if there was possibility for that. So refugees were as if you came from the moon, especially if you couldn't understand the language. So I had experienced already a lot of prejudice. I'd become very shy and withdrawn, and Anne was very outgoing. She was very popular. I had an older brother. When I told her, my brother is 15 years old, she said, when can I come and meet him? Because she was already, if you read her diary, she was already very interested in boys. And I had a brother, so boys was nothing special for me, you know. So, but we became friends, but not best friends, because I said, you know, I was quite a different, at that time, quite a different type from her. And, but unfortunately, the Germans started their conquering of Europe. And in May 1940, so after we had been only a few months in Amsterdam, at night we heard aeroplanes and guns, and we put on the radio, and the news was terrible. The announcer said, the Germans are trying to invade our country, but don't worry, we are going to protect it. But of course, they had no idea the might of the German army at the time. And as well, you know, the war had changed. They landed with lots of parachutes behind. Holland is under sea level, the flooded part of the country. That's how they got out in the First World War. They flooded it, and then the army just passed the country. But this time, they landed behind the waterline, and they occupied. It was a 5-day war, and it was the first time that a civilian city in this war had been bombed, Rotterdam. 10,000 casualties. And the news came, if you are not going to capitulate, we are going to bomb all your cities. Of course, the Dutch government couldn't accept that. So after 5 days, they signed a peace treaty, and the German army marched in. We still tried to get a boat at the harbor to escape to England, but it was too late. So we thought, well, we'll see what happened. And nothing happened. So we were quite happy. We thought, well, perhaps nothing will happen in an occupied country. The Dutch said, don't worry, we'll protect you. But slowly the measures against the Jewish population started to come. It was on posters, it was in the newspapers, it came over the radio. And it was not life-threatening. There were no attacks on Jews. You were not allowed to go out in the evening late or in the morning. You were not allowed on public transport. Well, everybody had a bicycle, it didn't really matter. Then you were not allowed to go on cinemas or swimming pools and things like that, not in theaters. But, you know, we lived, it was not too bad. But then we had to leave our schools and go to Jewish schools. And it became already much more difficult. We were not allowed really to mix with non-Jewish people, not allowed to visit them, not to go in their shops to buy, only in Jewish shops. And then in the Jewish schools, that started to become the real danger. The Nazis came with trucks to the Jewish school, said to the kids, not to the whole school, but to some classes, we have a truck, go down. And the kids went on, and in the evening the parents waited for the children to turn up, didn't turn up. So went to the German police, tried to find out where the children, didn't get an answer. Those children were never ever seen again. Only after the war we heard that they were sent to Mauthausen. I don't know if you've heard of that camp. That was a very, very terrible Austrian death camp. And they were just thrown down from the cliffs. But luckily we didn't know that at the time, but nevertheless the children disappeared. And then in 1942, about 10,000 young people got a call-up notice to be deported to work in German factories. And that was the time when many, especially refugee parents, decided, you know, first they kill German Jews and send them to ghettos, and then suddenly they want them back in Germany, and they didn't trust that. So my father called us together, and he said, I have spoken with some wonderful Dutch people. You know, every occupied country had a resistance movement, meaning the people didn't want to be occupied, and they formed groups, and they did particular dangerous things, but as well they printed ration cards, but as well they shot particularly bad Germans, they blew up trains or cars where a German was sitting in, and all kinds of things. But as well, many of those people from the resistance offered their homes to keep Jewish families safe. So my father said he has contact made with people from the resistance, and they're willing to keep us safe there as long as the war will last. At that time, you know, America had already come in the war, and my father said, it won't be long, perhaps just till Christmas. And so he said, but nobody, the apartments are quite small, nobody can take a family of 4, so we have to split up. He said, I will go with my mother, and my father will take Heinz. And I started to cry. I was 13 years at the time. And I said, no, I don't want to be separated, because we had been separated before. And my father explained, if we are in 2 different places, the chance that 2 of us will survive is bigger. He mentioned survive. And with 13, that was the first time that I realized it might be a matter of life and death. And when you're 13, that was actually quite scary. But this is what happened. We moved to this safe house, and we were for 2 years in hiding. So at the same time when the Frank family, because Anne's older sister Margot got the same call-up notice as my brother, he was 16, so already with 16 they wanted to kill those people, young people. And because they were never sent, those people who did go were never sent to Germany to work in German factories, but they were sent again to Mauthausen and just murdered there. They were never ever seen again. The Dutch have actually, if ever you go to this camp, have a huge, huge monument for all those 10,000 and many more young Dutch Jewish people who were executed there, thrown down from the cliffs actually. So we were for hiding in 2 years, same as the Frank family. We changed about 7 times hiding places, because the Germans knew that not everybody had appeared when they were called up, and they really wanted to catch every Jew. So at night they knocked on doors, people had to open, they made house searches, and tried to find the Jewish in hiding. So in every hiding house, we had a hiding place within the house. So again, the people from the resistance came and made a false partition, or sometimes under a floorboard. So when the knock came, we quickly went in there and hoping they wouldn't find us. But you know, the people who hid us, if this happens very often, they were nervous, they didn't dare to sleep. They said, you have to change hiding place, we can't take the tension any longer. So we moved around perhaps 7 times in those 2 years. The Frank family, if you've read the diary, they stayed in the same hiding place in Otto Frank's office. Nevertheless, they were betrayed. And my father and brother were living in the country at that time, and the woman where they were staying, that was in 1944, was blackmailing them for more money. Well, if you can't earn any money, we had some savings, and it was running out after 2 years. And so my father phoned my mother, we were on telephone, and he said, you must find us a hiding place, because we can't stay with this woman. And it was very, very difficult to find hiding places, because many people had been arrested, many didn't want to do it anymore. Even Dutch young people were picked up from the street and went into hiding. And so it took my mother in touch with the resistance about 3 weeks to find a safe place. And it was a Dutch nurse, he came forward saying she has a safe house. And it turned out she was actually a double agent. And she got my father and brother to this house, but 2 days later they were arrested. The Nazis came in with their own keys. In this house, this nurse betrayed 200 Jewish people. And after the war, there was a court case against her, and she only got 4 years. But what happened was, because we were betrayed at the same time, I had been very, very miserable in hiding, and occasionally my mother and me, we looked very Dutch, blonde hair and blue eyes, so occasionally we took the chance to visit my father and brother. And this place where they were now in Amsterdam was very near where we were staying. So on the Sunday we went to visit them, the day when they had got there. And on Tuesday, 11th May, it was my 15th birthday, and we were sitting down at breakfast, and there was a knock on the door in the morning. Morning was always safe. And the Nazis stormed in and went straight to us and took us away. So it turned out, of course, when we didn't know that at the time, but what had happened, they had followed us when we had visited my father and brother, and so they knew where we were and they took us away. So it was on a Wednesday. I was interrogated, I was beaten up really very hard. They wanted to know from me who had helped us those 2 years, but I was in shock and I didn't really say anything. Eventually they let me go. Then we were, the first few nights we were in a prison, which was terrible, and then we were taken to a holding camp, and on Friday we were already put on a list to be deported eastward. And that really meant really bad news, because we knew about the camps in Germany and Poland. The BBC had sent broadcast out. You were not allowed to listen to foreign radio, only to Dutch radio and German radio, because they told lies about the war. But the British radio, the BBC, of course, told about what was really going on. And I remember all the people where we were hiding had a little Bakelite radio hidden in a cupboard so that nobody would hear. And at 9 o'clock, the Dutch language broadcast came out, and it started always with da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da. That is the BBC from London, and we were glued on to hear the news. And one thing, they always mentioned that 300 death camps in Germany and Poland, and Auschwitz was always mentioned as the biggest, where Jewish people were systematically being gassed. So we were taken in a cattle truck. You might have seen pictures of that. That's really good trains, where not for human transportation at all, but about 80 people were pushed in there, and with a tiny little opening for air, 2 buckets, one for toilets and one for clean water. And so the train was set in motion, and it was terrible, but it was the last time that we were together as a family. And my father, with tears in his eyes, it was for him, you know, for a family man, that he couldn't really protect us anymore. He said, "You'll be on your own now." He told us how we should look after each other and hygiene, and you know, later I had to laugh talking about hygiene. You know, there was no possibility to keep anything clean or whatever. And but he, you know, we didn't know where we were going. And there were labor camps. The chance that we would go perhaps to a labor camp was still a possibility. And my brother, tell you a little bit about him. He was actually a wonderful musician. Already as a 4-year-old, he could play piano and he composed, but in hiding he had to be very, very quiet. So he started to paint, and he created some amazing paintwork. And he told me, that was actually the last conversation I had with him, that before they escaped from this woman who had blackmailed them, he hid the paintings under the floorboard with a notice on it that belongs to the Heinz and Erich Geiringer, and after the war he's coming to pick it up again. And he said to me, "You'll be amazed what I've done for oil paintings." And then eventually the train stopped and the doors were thrown open, and we saw we were in Auschwitz. Well, we really thought this is the end of our lives. You can imagine how you feel. The next command was men and women. Anybody of you been in Auschwitz at all? Birkenau? It's a huge, huge area, perhaps 10 square miles, and there were several camps. Auschwitz that's a well-known name. That was a big men camp, but Birkenau was a women's camp. That was with small wooden barracks. Auschwitz was the Polish officers used to live there before the war. But Birkenau, where the women were, was a new bit which they built actually for Russian prisoners at first. And it was just wooden barracks, nothing in it. And they built some bunks there, but I'll tell you a bit later about that. So, and the first, so the men had to walk away to Auschwitz, and we were in Birkenau. And you can imagine the saying goodbye to people. Perhaps you will never ever see them on earth again. So that was, of course, a very, very emotional moment. And my father, I will never forget that. He took me by the hands and looked at me and said, "God will protect you." And it made an impression on me because, you know, he was not religious, but I suppose at this moment that was the only thing he could hand me over to God to look after me. And then they walked away. And then there was big silence, and then we heard whisper, "Dr. Mengele, Dr. Mengele." He was a camp doctor, a proper medical man, but he wasn't there to help people, but he was there to decide who was going to die and who was going to live. And the next command is rows of 5, so we had to, everything was rows of 5, had to stand in rows of 5, and he came, and just with a fraction of a second, he looked at you and he decided this side or this side, life or death. And that was the first miracle that happened. My mother had a hat and coat, and she gave it to me, and I didn't want to wear it. It was a very hot May day. And she said, "Yeah, perhaps it will come in handy, you know, when we're going to be killed," because that's what we really thought. Still, she gave it to me. And it had a big rim, and when this Mengele looked at me, he didn't really see how young I was. And that's what saved my life at this first selection. Many, many girls who were even 16 and 17 were taken to the wrong side. And then we were marched into a big, big barrack, and the next command, undressed completely naked, and the Nazis, the young SS, with their guns pointing at us, laughed about our embarrassment. And then we had to go in front of a table. We were all tattooed. We were told, "You're not a human being, you're just a cattle who gets a number. And if ever we need you, we want you, you're going to be called out by number. Forget you have a name." Then all our head was shaved, and we were about 600 people. And while this happened, it took all long, and we were registered name and everything. The documentary, exactly everything was written down. And actually, I was a few years ago in Auschwitz, and I was shown those books where the names were, when I came in, what I had said, and as well I found the names. They showed me that of my father and brother, his number, which barracks they were, what works they were doing. Everything was really registered, quite amazing. Of course, all those records, when the Russian went into Poland, took them, but most of it they've given back. And if you go there and you have contact, you have family, then you can go and look at all those, the barracks are used now at administration, and everything is there, which the records. And then there are people who deny that it has happened, where there's so much proof that it all has happened. Anyway, and while all this happened, they told us, and this is what I object most, and that was extra cruelty. They didn't have to do that. They told us with much laughter that the family who went to the other side were told they were going to have a shower, and some they were even given soap and a towel, and they stood there, and of course no water came but gas. And within 15 minutes they were dead. So can you imagine a mother who had just been separated from her toddler or from her even teenage daughter, or a daughter who had been separated from her mother, how they felt when they knew what had happened to them. And then when all this was, and then all our hair was shaved, still naked, they told us then, and now it's your turn to go to the shower. Well, we didn't want to go but they called reinforcement and we were pushed into a barrack, but this was a shower block. So we had our shower and then we were taken out to our barrack. And as I say, this was only built for temporary. That was just low wooden barracks with bunks on each side, 3 high, just wooden structures, about as big as this platform, and 10 people had to sleep in there. You had no possession. Before, when we came out of the shower, we passed a big heap of clothes and we were thrown one garment which never fitted you. Could have been a winter coat or a night dress, and on the next heap you got 2 shoes. That was all the possessions we ever had. In the morning we got our breakfast, which was a little mug of liquid. In the evening we got a chunk of bread. That was all you ever got. You got no lunch, so you had to make do. And some people wanted to keep this bread for the morning so that they would have for the day, but you had nowhere to keep anything. So the only place was to sleep, put your head on it in the night. But what happened, not the first week or so, but afterwards, people were so hungry that they, under your head, they just ate it away. So that was no solution. So you had only in the evening, you had a piece of bread, and that is what you had to keep going. It is a miracle that my mother and me survived. And many more little miracles happens. I saw my father at one occasion on the other side of the fence, so I knew that he hadn't been selected, and my brother, he told me my brother was safe. But the worst time that happened to me was the worst experience. I will never ever forget any even little detail about what has happened. That we were full of lice, and once a week we were deloused having a shower. And so we came out of the shower naked, and there was Mengele, and the selection was taking place. That happened from time to time. And that might have been, we didn't know, of course, which month it was. It was starting to be cold, so it must have been back October. And so I walked naked in front of Mengele, and he let me through. And then my mother, she was a rather tall lady, and like any mother would do, she very often gave me a piece of her bread ration, and she had become quite thin. And she really didn't look very well. And so he looked at her, she had to turn around in front of him. And with 40, that was still our Dutch transport, but 40 women from our Dutch transport, she was selected out to be guest. And I still ran to her to say goodbye, and one of those capos, those were the Polish supervisors, beat me with a stick over the back. You're not allowed to say goodbye. And we were separated. But through a miracle, my mother was saved, but I didn't know that. And it became winter, and I was very, very desperate. I had frostbite on my toes. I was starving, I was freezing, and I was called out, and I thought, well, this is now somebody, a capo wants me, or a Nazi wants me for something. And I went trembling outside, and there stood my father with his SS boss. He told me his boss took him over. Can you imagine? There were thousands and thousands and thousands of people, many, many big camps, A, B, C, D, with many barracks. How he knew where I was, I have no idea. And the first question he asked me, of course, is, where is Mutti, mother? And I told him she had been selected. You should have seen his face. He crumpled in front of my face, and we both cried. And it was terrible to tell him that. But he gave me then a little bit of hope. He said, my brother was okay, the war will soon finish, we'll soon be together again, and Mommy Mutti will protect us, and and so. And we cried, and then I saw he came still twice, and then I never saw him again. And in the meantime, of course, the Russians were approaching. And the Germans took every day, they emptied barracks of people and they marched out on foot. It was winter, it was snowing, there was big snow, it was one of the coldest winter on records. And people were marched into Germany or Austria. And again, by luck, my mother and me, we were reunited again. It's all very miraculous stories. We were together and we decided we wouldn't go on those marches because we were too weak. We would never have made it. And this is because we stayed in Auschwitz, so to stay in Auschwitz really saved our lives. One morning, it must have been January, we woke up and it was very, very quiet, no dogs barking, no shouting, and we went outside and the Germans had left, fled, because the Russians were approaching. Actually, they were not that near. They were about 10 days away. We were 10 days on our own. Many, many people still died from starvation and from the cold. And I was one still of the strongest people. You know, we couldn't bury people. We had to just carry them out from the barrack and heap them up behind the barrack. You can imagine, everything was frozen. The snow was set high. There was a little pond outside where we went to hack the ice to get a bit of water. We found bits of food, bit of bread. There were the barracks where a lot of things were stored. So we were not starving, but it was just uncooked, cold bits of food. And every day we lost many, many of our people. And then it was 27, I mean, we didn't know it was 27 of January, which is Holocaust Memorial Day, which is a day which they say the liberation of Auschwitz by the Russians. And indeed, the Russians came and put up a field kitchen there, stayed with their troops, with their horses and their guns and everything. And that was the first time we got proper food. And they gave us metal containers and filled it up with very greasy cabbage soup. But the smell nearly drove us mad. Can you imagine? We had no food, just a bit of bread for 9 months. And, you know, food was, people ask very often, what did you talk when you were talking? Only about food, what we would eat if ever we get out again. And there we ate and ate this greasy cabbage soup. And in the morning, many people had died from eating because the body had not the strength to digest the food. And I spent a terrible night on a bucket because the food just ran through me. And then the Russians left again and were pursuing the Nazis. And so I decided I would go to Auschwitz men camp to try to find my father and brother. And so I went through the snow. It was about 3 miles walking, and I found it, which was all very treacherous journey. And then there the Russian had sort of made a headquarters, and I looked all around in the barracks, and I found 2 people who looked familiar. And I went to the one, and he looked very ashen and skinny, but there was something familiar. And I said, I think I know you. And he said, well, I'm Otto Frank, Anne's father. And he said, you're Eva Geiringer? I said, yes. Have you seen my father or my brother? He said, yes, but they've gone with the Germans, because when the Germans fled, they took most of the people with them still. After the war, those were called the death marches, because most people perished. You can imagine, underfed, to walk perhaps days, perhaps weeks. People couldn't make that. But I didn't know that, you know. I said, well, the war will soon finish and my father and brother will still be all right. And then the Russians took us away from there, and that we traveled for 4 months with the Russian going eastward. We couldn't go back yet, the war wasn't finished. And I must say the Russians treated us very, very well, with respect. They fed us, they gave us Russian uniforms, and looked after us very, very well, till we ended up in Odessa eventually, which is now the Ukraine, and there we waited for the end of the war. And when that came, of course, there was great jubilation that we had made it. but we were still very anxious to get back home. And eventually there came a New Zealand troop transport ship, and we traveled through the Mediterranean to Marseille, then up through the whole of France and back into Holland again. And there we waited for news, and when that came, that was of course very, very bad. It said we got that in July, so we got back in June, so we traveled from end of January till June. We really traveled around all over Europe, really, and Russia. And the letter from the Red Cross said, not very emotional, we have to tell you that your husband Erich Gering and your son Heinz Gering perished in Mauthausen, this terrible Austrian death camp, several days before the American army came to liberate that camp. Well, this was the last straw. I had really hoped that we would be a family again and eventually life could go back to normality. But when that would never ever happen, I became very, very depressed. And Otto Frank came as well to tell us about he had heard already he was with us on this transport all the time, and he had heard that his wife had died, but he had great hope for his two girls. And he got as well, he met actually two people who had been there when his daughters, they were taken away from Auschwitz. If they would have stayed in Auschwitz, they would have been liberated in January, but they were still okay and they would have survived. But they were taken out there, were taken to Bergen-Belsen, and they died there in April. They think in April, they are not sure, of course, exact date, as well a few days before the British soldiers liberated that camp. He was 57 years old at the time, and after he left us, telling us this news, my mother and me said, how can this man carry on with his life? He has nothing left. And he always used to say, the only thing I have is the clothes on my body. I have nothing else, everything is lost. And a few days later, he came again with a little parcel under his arm, and he said, I must show you something. And Anne's diary had been saved, that's another little story. And he said, can I read you something? And he opened it, and he was very, very emotional. He started to read a sentence, but he always burst into tears. It took him 3 weeks to read it through. And he said, you know, I didn't know my own daughter. He was very surprised about what Anne has written about. Not about what happened, the daily thing, but about and that is, as personally, I think, the interesting part of that she had an opinion of humanity, of women's rights, about religion. You know, she really was already a little philosopher. But I'm running out of time. I just want to tell you that Otto and my mother became great friends. And when I finished school, I was still very depressed and I didn't know what to do with my life. And Otto and my mother decided I should become a photographer. And I didn't really care. And Otto knew somebody in London who had a photographic studio. And I came here for a year, become an apprentice. And I met a young man who had come from Israel to study economics. And we fell in love. And after 6 months, he said to me, Eva, will you marry me? And we can start a new life and go to Israel. And I said, no, thank you. And I said, I didn't tell him who I was. I didn't tell him I'd been in a camp or anything. And I told him I was Dutch, which I wasn't. I was actually still stateless. He told me he was an Israeli. He was a German refugee as well. But so Otto Frank kept an eye on me, and he came over one day, and I told him this young man has asked me to marry him, but I said no, because I'm going back to my mother. And he was a bit embarrassed, and he said, well, your mother and me have fallen in love as well, and once you get married, we like to get married. So I went back to this young man, and I said, you can marry me now? And That's what we did. We came to Amsterdam. Next year we went to Amsterdam and got married here in Amsterdam. But my mother asked him not to take me to Israel because, you know, at that time you had to go by boat or you didn't fly, and it was expensive. My mother said that I'll never be able to see. I was the only member of the family, so we decided we would stay in England. So that's why we were still here, and we have now 3 daughters and 5 grandchildren who are of course born in England, and so this is part of my life. But I never spoke about my experience till 40 years afterwards. It was really too difficult. And that is what most Holocaust survivors, you know. At first, when we came back, I wanted to tell people how terrible it was, but people didn't want to know. People said, we all have suffered, let's just move on. But then later, after 20, 30 years, people started to question, but then we were not ready. But I think I started to speak when I realized that the world hadn't really learned anything. There's still a lot of wars and discrimination, and we really have to change our ways. And this is why I really started to speak, and I wrote 3 books in the meantime, and I speak a lot now, spend most of my time actually talking all over. But I'm getting on, and most of I was 15, I was one of the youngest survivors really, and every day I hear about somebody dying. So we are not here forever, and so it will be you, the young people, the students who are here, to carry the story on, to tell future generations of what has happened. Well, thank you very, very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for telling such a powerful story. We'll move straight to questions from the audience in the interest of time. So the first question, I'll recognize Eduardo Chazan, who's actually the president of the Oxford Chabad Society.
Thank you so much, Mr. Schloss. Yeah, thank you so much for presenting. This is quite an amazing story. And I wonder, now when you recall it back and you analyze the future, what do you think is the Jewish people relation to the non-Jews going to be the next 10, 20 and 50 years?
Well, you know, I hope that people will come to their senses and realize that we are all human beings. We can all live very, very well in harmony together. And what our personal religion or personal opinion is nobody's business. We can live our own life and still be a wonderful community and share our thoughts. But obviously we are not ready till now to accept this. But I think, you know, the young people have great hope for the new generation that things will change. So through my bad experience, I'm still an optimist that things is going to go better and things will improve relationship between different people.
Thank you. Next question, we'll go to the member just over there in the 3rd row.
Just a few sentences. I'm here with my husband, and we are post-war children, but our parents went through Holocaust. So we understand very well through what you went. And the other sentence will be, can I congratulate you? Is today your 90th birthday?
No, not my 90th birthday.
So very shortly.
Well, 89, but in 11th of May was my 89th birthday.
Okay, so next
No.
Okay, congratulations anyway.
But tomorrow would be Anne Frank's 89th birthday, and there is actually in London a little, well, I don't know if it's a party, but an event for Anne.
We are very privileged that you
Thank you.
Eva, The past decade has seen the rise of populism, characterized by nationalism and xenophobia in the West, with the right-wing governments in Austria and Italy being the latest examples. Political opponents regularly charge populist movements and their leaders of being fascist, sometimes even drawing comparisons to Adolf Hitler and his party. How do you view the rise of populism in the West?
Well, I think it has become a danger, but I still think they are not powerful enough yet to take over. And you know, as I say, I'm an optimist, and I think people will realize that they are not really changing the world for the better, and people will, I mean, they're in power, but they're not all powerful. And this is important. You know, once they're at the majority, then they might be of danger, but they are not. And I think people, the other parties are still powerful enough to, I mean, there's no government is racist anywhere at the moment. And that is the importance. This is the Hitler time, it came from the top, and the people followed. And now it is the people. But as long as the government will forbid, like here, when there is anything, or in America, or wherever is anything anti-Semitism, it is being punished.
Thank you. So one of your most recent efforts to ensure the Holocaust will not be forgotten by future generations constituted the recording of you for virtual reality answers to numerous questions using holographic technology. You were talking a little bit about that before. How did this initiative come about, and how does holographic technology enhance the impact of yours and other people's stories?
Well, in California, the part from the Spielberg organization realized that we won't be around much longer, and people are worried that the story will be watered down or even eventually be forgotten. And so they decided they would get as many as possible victims from different camps, from different ghettos, from different kind of, not just Jewish people, from all the genocides, to take them to a hologram. Technically, I don't quite know how it goes, but I was in California sitting in a huge, huge globe with 116 cameras, and I was asked a whole week, I was asked 1,000 questions about my experience, which have all been recorded. And I'm sitting now at the moment in New York in a museum, just sitting still like that, and schools and people come in and can ask me different questions, but it must be any of those 1,000 questions which I've answered. So it must be questions about my experience in the Holocaust. And they have, as I say, they have many, many people already interviewed, so from different places in the world. And so those people will be able to repeat this answer, like when you ask me questions now. But I was just saying before, of course they have to know first the story of the Holocaust, so it has to be taught in schools. And I hope it will happen. In America, for instance, I've just heard only 6 states in America it's compulsory to teach the Holocaust. So that's not really enough. So I hope it will be a general world Holocaust. And I mean, I just got from the Anne Frank House in Amsterdam that 17 million people have this year looked at their website. So that is an enormous amount. So now with all this website and with all that, of course, you can tell a lot of things, but people have to be interested, people will have to look at it. You know, it's not going to say, well, it is there, you have to, it's not as if they go to school and they're taught, so they have to have the initiative to be interested in it. So through technology, of course, I think the story can be kept alive, which is very, very important.
Thank you. We have time for one final question, so we'll go to the lady all the way in the back.
You mentioned your brother's paintings that he left in the house. Did you ever have the opportunity to go back and have a look whether they're still there, and in general to revisit those places that were influential for your life during the war?
Well, after Otto got the diary, I realized the only thing we have from Heinz are his paintings, but we were reluctant to go to this house, to this woman who really, through her blackmailing, all this has happened to us. But luckily she had disappeared and other people moved. And yes, I did get the 30 paintings, and I had them for a long time, but a few years ago I donated them to the Resistance Museum in Amsterdam, and they made a big exhibition, but I have copies made, and in South Africa they made an exhibition now about his life and his paintings, and we have got a copy here in Britain now in the Jewish Museum. And if you're a teacher, so you can, it's a traveling exhibition, you can ask for it and you can get it, and the university can get it as well. And it's not just his painting, but his life, and as well he wrote many poems, very, very emotional. And yes, so that I keep his life, that he hasn't lived for nothing. And that is really, I think, what we all want, that when we die, that we haven't lived for nothing, that we leave something behind. And in Yad Vashem, the Israel Holocaust Museum, they really try to find the 6 million names at least, so that at least the name of everybody is recorded who perished in this terrible event.
Thank you. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for this evening. Please join me in thanking Eva Schloss for joining us today.